Liberal MPs are meeting in Saskatchewan this week to prepare for Parliament's return and make sure they're on the same page as the government heads into an election year. Several contentious issues are being raised, among them new gun legislation. But would rural caucus members back a handgun ban? Joining me now from Saskatoon is Minister of Border Security and Organized Crime Reduction, Bill Blair. Hi, Minister Blair. Great to see you again. You've been tasked, of course, with studying a full ban on handguns and assault weapons. Yet there are members of your caucus, primarily from rural areas, who are divided over the effectiveness or the potential effectiveness of that ban. One of your colleagues, for example, Liberal MP, and I apologize if I'm mispronouncing this, but Judy Hudgkin spoke to CBC and basically expressing concerns about exactly that. What do you say to her?
Well, you know where there is complete agreement among our caucus is that we have a responsibility as a government to do everything necessary to keep our citizens and our communities safe. And so I've been tasked with examining a number of different measures, including a handgun ban, so that we can make our communities safe, make it more difficult for criminals to get access to any firearm, in particular handguns, because the level of violence is unacceptable to Canadians, it's unacceptable to us, and we're prepared to take action.
But if your caucus is so divided, I mean, are you aware, I guess, of that division?
Well, and I have the confidence. I know of my caucus. I've been asked to examine this issue. That means to look at the evidence objectively, to speak to stakeholders across the country, to examine the experience in other jurisdictions, and to find the best way forward and report that back to the government. And so that's the work I'm undertaking to do. I've had the opportunity here to meet with a number of my caucus colleagues. I remain confident that we can do that work, and I've asked for their help because I think it's important to go to communities across the country to find out how Canadians feel about this issue, and to also demonstrate our absolute resolve to deal with violence in all of our communities. What has been experienced in Toronto, in Surrey, BC, in Montreal, and in communities right across Canada is unacceptable to us. And so we're prepared to take the steps necessary to keep our communities safe. We just want to make sure it's the right steps and that we consider every possibility, look at the evidence, and come up with policy and regulation that will actually make a difference in keeping our communities safe.
You have, of course, a long history in law enforcement. From your perspective, do you think a ban would be effective in mitigating the violence that you just described?
Well, I will tell you, in and of itself, just that alone would not be sufficient. We have to do the many things, not only to interdict and reduce the supply of guns that are currently available to criminals who would use them to victimize others, but reduce the demand for those guns. We're quite prepared to look at any response, including banning certain weapons, handguns, for example, if that will be effective. And I'm not going to presume the outcome of that examination. I have a job to do. The Prime Minister is very clear. Has asked me to examine this issue and examine the evidence and come back with recommendations. But we will consider any measure that we believe will be effective in keeping our communities safe. There is no greater responsibility of any government than the safety of their citizens, and we're prepared to act in order to keep our communities safe.
How do you determine the effectiveness of whatever measures you pursue if there is such a lack of data about where these guns are coming from? We don't know for certain that they are legally obtained. In fact, most of them appear to be coming, or a majority of them appear to be coming from south of the border.
Well, I will tell you there are essentially two sources of handguns that are used by criminals in Canadian society. Some of those guns, just exactly as you mentioned, and in my experience as a police officer, are smuggled in from the United States. We've made some pretty significant investments over the past 3 or 4 years in increasing the capacity and the ability of CBSA and the RCMP and others to conduct investigations to limit and interdict that supply of guns coming across the border. They still come across that way, but we've made real progress. What we are hearing from some police jurisdictions, the Toronto Police, for example, and also in Surrey, BC, is that more and more they're encountering handguns on their streets that have not been smuggled in from the United States, but had rather been illegally diverted from legitimate domestic sources. And so, you know, it is not sufficient just to solve one problem. We have to do everything that is necessary to keep these guns off our streets, to limit and interdict the supply to criminals, but at the same time, we have to go into those and deal with those young individuals who are using firearms to commit crimes and take the steps necessary to reduce the demand for those guns to keep our communities safe. We're quite prepared to look at any measure, a handgun ban, but also we'll be looking at additional measures that can be taken to interdict that supply and reduce the number of guns that are illicitly coming into this country from other places.
The problem, Minister, though, is that that data is not available to the public via the RCMP, via those police forces. We have not been able to see, or that data has not been produced for the public. Do you understand, I guess, how there would be concern among people about, you know, the public will ultimately judge the measures you pursue based on their effectiveness. But if we don't know the source of these guns, how can we judge the effectiveness?
And Vashi, one of my responsibilities, first of all, I am not unfamiliar with the evidence. As you're well aware, I was a police chief in Toronto for 10 years, where we did everything we could to trace the origin of all the crime guns that came into our possession that had been involved in violent criminal acts in Toronto. There is a great deal of data and evidence that we can rely on, but I will certainly acknowledge that it's incomplete because not every jurisdiction collects that evidence or collects it in a consistent way. One of the things that I'll be undertaking to do is to get the best available data from sources. We know that many of these firearms are in the possession of law enforcement now. We will take the steps necessary to get as much information about the origin of those guns so that the steps we take will be effective in keeping our community safe. Certainly, we acknowledge the incomplete nature of the data, but we do have evidence from a number of police jurisdictions and from weapons that have been seized that can inform this discussion. You know, the fact that we don't have 100% of the data that we would like to have does not mean that we are unable to move forward and to make important decisions about how to keep our communities safe.
Before I let you go, I do want to ask you about another subject or another topic under your portfolio, and that is the issue of asylum seekers. Our colleagues at the Globe and Mail reported some new statistics today obtained from the CBSA. The Immigration and Refugee Board has only managed to finalize 15% of the more than 27,000 asylum claims made by people who illegally entered Quebec. The wait time a refugee claim hearing in Canada has increased more than a third over the past 2 years to 19 months. Is that a sign that what you're trying to do to fix this issue, which you'll call, I know you won't call it a crisis, but this issue, is it a sign that the plan isn't working?
No, not at all. And in fact, actually, we know that the majority of those refugee claims came about as a surge that took place about 12 to 14 months ago, and that created a backlog. And so we've put additional money into the Immigration and Refugee Board, the IRB, in order to deal with that surge and increase. We recognize that backlog and the amount of time that it's taking to clear it is unacceptable to Canadians. It's unacceptable to us. And so we're making the investments that are necessary to move those through in an efficient way. You know, people who seek asylum in this country are entitled to due process, but that due process must be done in the most efficient way possible. And for those who are determined to not to be eligible for asylum in this country and are therefore subject to removal, that action has to take place in a timely way as well. And so we're making the investments, which is one of the reasons I was given the job, to look at all of the processes that are currently in place to find ways that they might be improved, to be made more efficient, more effective, and to address the concerns that Canadians have raised about that backlog.
So when will that backlog decrease? When will that wait time go down?
Well, we're working on it right now. It is my intention to find ways to improve the efficiency of those processes, to move through that backlog as quickly as possible. We've also made significant progress in reducing the number of people who are presenting themselves at our borders irregularly seeking asylum. And you know, we did not experience the surge of last year, and this summer we've seen significant declines. And although we were quite prepared for an increase in numbers, it did not occur. And I think that reflects some very important work that has been done in the United States and other jurisdictions, on social media, and in communications to those communities and countries where people might consider coming to this country. They have to understand that seeking asylum in Canada is not a free ticket to permanent residency, that we are a country that respects our obligations but also upholds the rule of law, that our processes will be efficient, and that rule of law will be upheld and applied appropriately. And for those who are not eligible for asylum, that they will not be allowed to stay in this country. They will be subject to removal.
When you say, Minister, though, that you're working to clear the backlog as quickly as possible, when you refuse to provide a specific timeline, how can Canadians hold you to account for what you're saying?
Well, I will tell you, Vashi, I've been in this job now for a few weeks. We've already made significant investments in increasing the capacity of IRB. We've been making very significant steps to reduce the number of people that are presenting themselves at the border. We know there's a backlog that needs to be done. We've seen the amount of time that on average that it takes. It was very clear in the Globe article to take the amount of time to resolve those issues has expanded over the past 18 months. And so we are putting the resources in and taking the steps necessary to reduce it. We'll have more information on the progress that we're making once all of those resources are in place. But we have taken, I think, very effective steps to reduce the number of people that are appearing irregularly at our border. There's more work to be done, and we'll be engaging in discussions with the United States on modernization of the Safe Third Country Agreement and other steps that we know will be effective in reducing that backlog and making more efficient, restoring a more timely resolution of those claims to be able to reassure Canadians that that process is in fact working the way it's supposed to work.
Okay, I'll leave it there. Thanks a lot for your time, Minister Blair.
Thanks, Vashi.